to the programme. We begin with breaking news coming out of Afghanistan, where there's been an explosion outside Kabul International Airport. It happened around about half an hour ago. Our correspondent at the time, Charlotte Bellis, said that the team at Al Jazeera in the capital heard an explosion somewhere in the vicinity of the airport. Now, we're trying to get more clarification as to where that explosion happened. Some reports are suggesting it was inside, some are suggesting outside. John Kirby, who's a spokesperson for the Pentagon in the US, says, and we quote, "We can confirm an explosion outside Kabul airport. Casualties are unclear at this time. We will provide additional details when we can." Well, for most of the day, we've been, of course, talking to our correspondents about the warnings being given by the US and NATO allies as the evacuation continues, as they try to get their staff and associates out of the country. There were strong indications, even according to the Taliban, that such an imminent attack was pending. Some were pointing the fingers at ISIL, and we've been discussing whether ISIL had the capability of performing such an act, and if so, when and where. It seems that over several days, the Taliban have also been concerned about ISIL infiltration into the capital, Kabul, and of course, you might say, has been a prime target for anybody that might want to disrupt those operations. Thousands of people have been trying to leave the airport as the 31st of August deadline continues. And of course, where NATO and the US are planning to take as many people out as they can that have helped them through this 20-year process of trying to nation build in a country that seems to now, as we've seen in this last 2 weeks, been taken over by the Taliban. In the past 24 hours, the Taliban made it very clear that only those that were either American or international passport holders or had the appropriate visas to leave the country would be allowed to do so. Anybody else that didn't have the appropriate paperwork has been pushed back from the airport. Of course, the scenes that you're seeing now are of what 24 hours ago, when many people were hoping that they may be able to get into the perimeter of the airport facility and try to plead their case and get on as many of these flights that were heading either up north into the Central Asian republics and passengers being diverted there into Europe and North America, or via the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, as we're hearing some Afghans have already arrived in Uganda and in Qatar, where they are now being repatriated via domestic flights into the US. The issue of whether this was any sort of attack has yet to be determined. No one has taken responsibility. Let's join Rob McBride, our correspondent in the capital of Kabul. Rob, these details very sketchy. We have an idea from the Pentagon that an explosion has occurred. What did you hear, or what do we know about this explosion?
Well, this happened a little under 1 hour ago, and it was colleagues of ours in the Bureau, which is a couple of kilometres from where we are here, closer to the airport, actually heard it there. That's been confirmed by other sources as an explosion coming from the direction of the airport, and then it has since been confirmed by the Pentagon that they understand this is an explosion that has gone off. There's no word yet about any casualties, and it apparently happened at one of the centres that's close to the airport. We understand it's one of the encampments used by the contractors. Different contractors have different bases around the perimeter of the airport. It's apparently happened near to one of theirs, near to one of those encampments. Now, we're waiting to get confirmation that it is an explosion, but it comes at the end of a day of heightened tensions all around the airport, with these warnings of an imminent attack, a suicide attack from multiple sources by Islamic State, or at least the Afghan offshoot of that organization. Now, Islamic State has been active here in Afghanistan. They tried to establish themselves, especially since the demise of IS in other parts, in the parts of the Middle East. They tried to take root here. That was fought back against by the military, the government, and also with the support of the United States. And in fact, there was a real concerted effort by led by the United States to try to drive them out of Afghanistan. It resulted in a lot of serious attacks in 2019, which seriously diminished their ability. But we know that they have still been active, especially in the east of the country, with at least small units. They have been carrying out small attacks, especially in Kabul, and especially on some targets that the Taliban wouldn't attack, targets that they deem to be justifiable. So they have been threatening to carry out some sort of attack as this evacuation has continued. We know that they tend to thrive upon disorder and chaos, and with everything that's going on at the airport at the moment, with the evacuation, with thousands of people around there, with foreigners and people associated with foreign missions trying to get to the airport, it is an extremely vulnerable time. It is, from an IS point of view, a prime target. So there have been these warnings that an attack was imminent. We had these warnings earlier on in the week, but they have been really reinforced in the past 24 hours or so, confirmed by multiple sources, and even the Taliban themselves saying, yes, there is likely to be an attack, and also warning that, in fact, their Taliban fighters are just as much at risk as anybody else there at the airport.
And of course, Rob, there was great concern in the lead-up to, you might say, the sweeping victory of the Taliban to take over the country, that various prisons and areas of incarceration where ISIL operatives were being held had been, basically, they'd been let loose, the doors had been opened, but nobody had actually taken any note of where these individuals were going. So the threat level was increased as soon as those jails were opened.
That's right. And in fact, there is one prison close to the Bagram base. Bagram was the base that was the home to US forces and also its NATO allies during the long-running campaign here. And there was a prison quite close to there which housed a number of ISIL prisoners. Now, that prison was opened and the gates were thrown open, as with many other prisons throughout Afghanistan. It was assumed that a number of ISIL prisoners could well have escaped then. As we said, they have been responsible for some pretty audacious, pretty despicable attacks as far as Western governments are concerned, and also many people here in Afghanistan and the government is concerned, such as, attacking targets that the Taliban would not deem to be legitimate targets. So they have been responsible for some quite serious attacks. The Taliban relationship with them remains somewhat ambiguous at times. Officially, the Taliban says they have no dealings with Islamic State and will not have any dealings under the new administration with Islamic State. They've made that extremely clear, and as they've reiterated with these current threats, that their Taliban fighters are just as much at risk as any soldiers from the US or the other coalition allies or people thronging around the airport. In fact, if anything, Taliban would be more in the front line. They are more exposed, if you like, to some sort of a suicide attack by Islamic State, because, of course, that would be on the outside of the base. It's very difficult to see that they could ever penetrate the base and get close to Western soldiers. So Taliban would be just as much at risk. Having said that, there have been some occasions where the Taliban there have been suspicions that Taliban, at least at some local levels, have been working in coordination with Islamic State. But as I said, on a national level, the Taliban says it has nothing to do and will have nothing to do with the Islamic State group. But we are still waiting to see if this was indeed an attack, an actual bombing at the airport, and indeed what casualties there could be.
And of course, various contributors to Al Jazeera have said that there's no love lost between ISIL and the Taliban. But the real test of the Taliban's control over the country is whether they can actually find out where this group or various members of this group are actually operating from, and whether they have the information network in place, as they'd like perhaps the rest of the world to understand that they have this in place right now, whether it is actually effective in finding those that may be behind this attack on the airport, because it would be a test of their authority across the country.
It will be extremely interesting to see the relationship and the attitude of the Taliban, now in government, to Islamic State. You know, as we've said, they've had a slightly ambiguous relationship towards them in the past. The previous government, as we said, made extraneous efforts to try to wipe them out back in 2019 and very nearly did so. You would have thought if you were Islamic State, you would be looking with relish at what's happening, the withdrawal of US forces, all of its allies, the collapse of the Ashraf Ghani government and the Taliban coming into force. Remember, of course, that the Taliban were extremely, they made the point very strenuously a few days ago in all of their first briefings when they suddenly found that they were the government here and they were running the country, that they would not give any kind of haven to groups that were intent on bringing the fight to Western governments. That, of course, was why the Western governments got involved all of those 20 years ago. That's the big fear that remains for the United States and its allies. And the Taliban, quite smartly, were very, very quick to allay those fears, saying that the new Afghanistan would not be a haven to any groups, such as, presumably, Islamic State. But it will be interesting to see what relationship they do have with Islamic State. Will they be as robust as the previous government in trying to wipe them out, in trying to push them out of Afghanistan? And from Islamic State point of view, what will their relationship be with the Taliban? When we were considering the possible attack on the airport, remember, of course, you've got Taliban fighters there. The thinking was that the Islamic State, if they did launch an attack, they would want to be very careful that they target certainly Westerners or Western forces or any members of the US military or its allies. It would, in the collateral damage, inevitably get passengers or people who are trying to get onto flights out of the country. But if you're Islamic State, you could probably justify that in as much as these people were effectively, from an Islamic State point of view, almost collaborating with foreign governments. And if they're collateral damage, then so be it. But they would be very careful, Islamic State, not to catch any Taliban in the as collateral damage, because they would know that if they want to stay in Afghanistan, despite all of the assurances from the Taliban that they're not going to give safe haven to any of these groups, they really have to stay under the radar, especially in the early days, early months, to see how this all plays out with this new government coming into power here.
Rob McBride, thanks very much. Rob McBride, our correspondent there. Let's cross over to Charlotte Bellis, who joins me now on the phone from Kabul. We managed to get a gist of what you said before, Charlotte, about the lead-up to this explosion. Just let me explain as well that what we can see now, our live pictures are from Kabul airport. We can still see helicopters landing and we can still see planes taking off. So the operation at the airport seems to be progressing as normal. But tell us what you know.
Well, we're just leaving the scene now, actually, and we heard ourselves a loud explosion about an hour ago. We got through as close as we could get to the airport. We understand it took place at Abbey Gate. That's what witnesses are telling us. That is one of the points of entry for these evacuation flights, for people trying to get on them. Usually it's crowded, there's a lot of people. The Taliban are outside that gate and have been doing security around that area. But I've been down there in recent days, and Americans have been overlooking that area also, standing on the fence line. So we understand an explosion took place, and then there was heavy gunfire afterwards. When we looked down the street towards it, there was heavy smoke. There were hundreds of people fleeing towards us. And Taliban fighters there were telling us to leave immediately because there was an explosion and an ongoing attack. A colleague of mine spoke to someone who was there. He said that there were lots of, quote, wounded and dead, and he said that Americans were shooting. It's quite unclear at this moment who may have set this explosion off. One Taliban contact told me that they believed that the Americans were destroying equipment at the time. But in contrast to that, we understand that the ISIL threat was quite high here. That's one of the reasons that many countries said that they have stopped their evacuations. The Americans also put out an alert, the Taliban saying today that no one can come near the airport because the ISIL threat is high, because they are looking at doing specifically car bombings in and around the airport to inflict, quote, maximum damage, as a Taliban contact told me today. So whether or not this is ISIL or something else is still unclear, but it looks like there certainly are casualties from this incident.
Of course, hard to predict the future, Charlotte, but if this is an incident that has been perpetrated by ISIL, it seems that all sides will have to decide and reconfigure their plans, perhaps about the 31st of August.
Yes, I mean, the security concerns have been growing here. We understand that for the most part, these evacuation flights are starting to slow. They were getting dozens off every day, and now there's certainly fewer flights taking off as they're kind of ramping down and now looking to get their remaining military out who have been facilitating this operation. But I think for the most part, it's full steam ahead on getting everyone out by the 31st. The Taliban has said it's certainly a red line that no one can stay. Whether or not this attack speeds things up, it's hard to tell.
Of course, we can see one military plane taking off from the airport as the sun sets across the Afghan capital. It does beg the question about security across the city as well, in terms of how much of the city the Taliban can control. I think either you spoke to us earlier in the day or Rob McBride did and said that more forces were being brought into the capital from the regions.
The Taliban have brought in all their most elite forces. Even on day one, they brought in 1,000 of their special forces when they took over the city. And then they've become increasingly organised as the days have gone on. Around the airport perimeter now, they have a unit known as the Badri 313s, which are the most elite special forces from the Taliban. They're associated with the Haqqani network, and they had been in control of the perimeter. Going down there just yesterday, I spoke with some of the commanders. They were from different areas, but they were trying their best to do crowd control, but it was very much a soft target, and you can see why ISIL would target it, because there were thousands of civilians, and the Taliban were fairly overwhelmed, and their best attempt to control and push people back was shooting in the air. They were resorting to beating people. We drove through a cloud of tear gas at one point. It was chaotic, and it has been, and there has been no improvement in the last 10 days in their management of this, and there's been a lot of blame to go around. The Taliban have said, well, we're controlling security, but why is this our problem? This is America's situation to sort out. They should have been more organised in managing these people. And it seems like it's never really been resolved. There was a deal between the Taliban and the US as far as security goes and who would manage what. But there's been so many loopholes, every side overwhelmed, and everyone just pushing as hard as they can to this deadline to get as many people out and then cut it, and the cards will fall as they lie.
Yeah, Charlotte, let me just bring you up to speed with what we're getting in terms of wires. We're getting a Turkish Defence Ministry quote. They're saying there were 2 explosions outside Kabul airport, no damage to any Turkish units. And from the US, we're getting 3 of their troops have been injured in the Kabul blast, but they can't tell us exactly where they were injured. So the Turkish and the Americans confirming certainly the blast and certainly injuries as well. Injuries on one side, one has to assume there may be injuries on the civilian side too.
Most certainly. I mean, if the Americans are saying that 3 of their personnel were injured, that doesn't surprise me, because when you go down to the Abbey Gate to get in that way, there is a post overlooking the gate where there's a number of US soldiers stationed. I watched them myself the other day overlooking the crowds. And then just a few metres from them, there is a Taliban checkpost, and they watch each other all day. And then there's dozens. The other day when we were there were hundreds of civilians packed like sardines, banging at the gate, hoping for a chance to get in, holding their papers up to the Americans. So if there has been an explosion in that vicinity, there are certainly Americans posted above that wall overlooking everything and may have been caught up in this. We heard this explosion at 5:40 p.m. local time, which is just over an hour ago. When we were there, we heard a second explosion, which was not as strong. And we also heard sirens coming from inside the airport. And then the Taliban had just pushed everyone back, and they had appeared to have brought in reinforcements. There were at least double the number of Taliban fighters down there guarding the entrance as there normally were. They were very tense. They were shooting in the air. I saw them break a camera from another journalist. And they were very tense and very concerned and shooting frequently.
Charlotte, we're also getting more news from the Americans that they suspect that this was a suicide attack. If that is the case, then it does lead into the direction of ISIL, doesn't it?
Yeah, ISIL's MO, if you will, in Kabul is to do suicide blasts that target civilians. Usually they target the Shia minority, and they have been a constant threat in the back of everyone's minds in Kabul for some years now, although it has been some time since they have pulled off any type of large attack. But they are very much enemies with the Taliban.